Well, welcome back. Let's get stuck in. We're going to start by sharing and debriefing the past week. So take a moment and turn to the others in your small group and just share your answers to these questions. Firstly, how did you go initiating chit-chat conversations this week? Secondly, did any meaningful conversations flow out of that? And finally, how did you feel about it? Were any of the skills that we talked about helpful? Now, I know that some of this is a stretch and it may have been uncomfortable, and I encourage you to keep giving it a go because it will become more natural as we learn these skills as we grow in them. So take a moment to debrief that together. So far, we've been talking about how to have good conversations, by starting in initiating chit-chat, listening well, and then leading into meaningful conversations. Today, we'll explore how we can sow seeds of faith into those conversations. How do we sow seeds? Who are the people around you that are open, responsive, warm, or interested to the seeds of faith that we are seeking to sow? Or in other words, who are our people of peace? Before we answer those questions, we're going to pause for a moment and focus on what it means to listen well. It's such an important skill when it comes to having good conversations. And so we're going to practice it and then debrief it. The way we're going to practice it is by, in your small groups, breaking up into pairs, so finding a partner, and practicing sharing and listening. So one of you in the pair will be sharing your answer to a question that I'll give you in a second. The other person is going to be the listener. And your goal is to listen well, to be attentive, to ask good questions, to bounce the focus back to your partner who is sharing. So you're going to practice this for a few minutes, and then you're going to swap roles. And so the sharer will become the listener, and the listener will become the sharer. Here is the question for you to discuss. What has been one of the most memorable days of your life, and what made it memorable? Maybe that felt a little bit artificial, so thanks for giving it a go. But just take a moment to share in your small groups your reflections. What did you observe about listening and speaking as you practiced? And how did you feel to either be listened to or to be asked to share?
If we're going to learn to have better conversations with people about Jesus, it's not going to necessarily be by learning better gospel outlines, but it's actually learning how to have better conversations, full stop. Learning to have conversations that are filled with grace, conversations that, as Paul would describe as being salty, filled with salt and life. And it's these conversations that will allow us to eventually have deeper conversations that lead to conversations about Jesus. We've been thinking about the different types of conversations and the skills that are needed at each level. Now, our conversations will go up and down between the levels. Just because we have a meaningful conversation with someone one week, it doesn't mean that we're going to have another meaningful conversation the next week. They may want to go back just to some chit-chat. Likewise, we may engage in a spiritual conversation with someone, only to find that it's just a little while before they're ready to go back and have another spiritual conversation again. And that's okay. In the meantime, we continue to love them, we continue to have conversations with them, and we continue to live authentic lives around them. So what are the skills that allow us to have spiritual conversations? Now, we learn best from stories, so if we have stories and examples, why don't we share them with one another? So here are 3 questions for your group. First, what helps us have spiritual conversations? Secondly, what stops us from having spiritual conversations? And thirdly, do you have any examples? Do you have any stories that you can share with your group of spiritual conversations? How did you go in reflecting on what is and isn't helpful when it comes to spiritual conversations? Now, all those listening skills that we've been learning about help us not only have meaningful conversations, but they're also really helpful in our spiritual conversations. So here are some other ideas.
So I think one of the things we can do is to be praying for opportunities to have spiritual conversations. Don't underestimate how important that is. I remember one time I'd been praying and fasting for my neighbour, and at the end of that fast she came to me. It was in May. She said, "I've brought you a birthday present," and that was 5 months after my birthday. And I said to her, it was a box of chocolates. I said, "Oh great, I can have those now." And then she wanted to interrogate that and to know what I was talking about, and I said, "I've been fasting." And that led to a most brilliant faith conversation with her. But it was all because I had begun with prayer.
Yeah. I think it's good too to prepare to speak to people about maybe just a snippet of your testimony when they ask a question like, why would you do that or whatever. One of the questions I've often been asked is, so why did you become a Christian? And my short answer is, something along, well, God really got my attention in a way that I couldn't deny. And I just leave it at that.
I love those little spicy comments that we can make that pique interest. Another thing we can do is to make the most of religious events. So one of the things I love to do, I shop locally, and when it comes to Christmas, I'll often ask our shop assistants, "What are you doing for Christmas?" And then I might explore what their beliefs are about Christmas. And invariably it allows an opportunity for me to share about what we do at Christmas as well.
Yeah. And in those conversations with others, it's important that we are really humble. If they ask or we have conversations, it's like, well, this is what I believe, or this is what I'm doing. But being really respectful of other people's beliefs, that just allows the conversation to actually to go a bit deeper without them feeling offended or affronted because we've said, well, that's just wrong or that's just rubbish. So there's got to be that humility as we have the conversations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another thing that's really helpful is just to listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit. It won't always happen, but occasionally I've experienced the Holy Spirit just prompt me in undeniable ways. One time I felt really prompted that I was to ring my friend and invite her to church. And that felt really out there. She's an atheist, and she'd told me many times she was an atheist. And so, but this little niggly prompt wouldn't go away all afternoon. And so in the end, I just got up the courage and I picked up the phone and I rang her, invited her to church. And she said, "That is the weirdest thing. I was just thinking this afternoon that I would like to come to your church."
Yeah. I find what's also helpful is when we're listening, to actually listen for areas of agreement, because Christians and non-Christians actually agree on a whole lot of things, and we may come from different perspectives, but again, it's really easy to bring that Christ-centered, that spiritual conversation into those areas of agreement. I'm just thinking things around human rights and just the dignity of humankind. That is such a Christian concept, but it's something that's so inbuilt into our secular culture as well, just the value of human life, and we can bring just a really Christ-oriented approach to that conversation.
So true. I remember once someone saying to me, "I'm not religious," and I just went, "Oh no, I agree with you. I'm not religious either. I really don't like religion." And that just, for her, was like, "Hang on a minute, you're a pastor of a church. I know that. What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
Good. Another thing I think is helpful is looking for just longings and hopes in people, and just exploring what they might be and helping them articulate those things and bringing our faith into that place.
One of the things I'm conscious of is, I love chit chat and I love small talk and I love talking with people, but I need to be really careful not to, if they do ask a question, trying to explain everything at once. Kind of like my little snippet of my testimony. Sometimes if they ask a question or want to know something about you, you don't have to unpack every bit of theology around that, but you have a conversation and then trust that God will allow another conversation to come up in the future. So saying less is sometimes better.
Yeah, so true. And I think part of that too, is just sowing seeds of faith where we can in conversations. And so I remember an incident where I was purchasing something and the shop assistant was saying, oh, we're carbon neutral here in how we do things, and really kind of environmentally friendly. And I just made the comment, oh, that's really interesting. I was just speaking about that last week in our church. And it just led to this little simple faith conversation. It didn't go into deep and meaningful places, but it was just sowing a seed in that conversation.
Yeah. When we have these spiritual conversations, I think we always need to be prepared to have questions asked back of us. And I know that freaks a lot of people out, like, what if I can't answer it and stuff like that. Often the questions they ask, we can answer to some degree. But it's okay if we can't as well, because we can say, oh, that's a great question, I'll think more about it, and why don't we come back and have a conversation, see if I can bring a better answer to you.
Yeah, and I think if we can't answer something too, it just says, people don't like people who are know-it-alls anyway, so if we actually are humble enough to say, that's a great question, I don't know, but I'm going to go away and explore that. Would it be okay if we met up and just had a chat again, and I'll do some research, you can do some research too, and come back with some answers. And as part of that too, sometimes it's really helpful just to ask permission, to share something spiritual. So I had an instance where my eye got healed through prayer. And I was at the optometrist because it had been significantly healed, and so I needed my prescription on my glasses changed because of it. And the optometrist couldn't work out what had gone on, why my eye had completely changed shape. And I said to him, do you want to know the God story? And it just allowed him to go, yeah, sure, tell me. But I just think actually asking that permission of, I'm not just going to lay it on you, but I'm actually going to ask whether you want to know.
So you can see there's a whole range of ways in which we can engage in spiritual conversations. And I actually just want to finish with one that we've already touched on in a sense, and that is actually just being a good listener of the other person and actually asking questions of them. I have had relationships with people in terms of friendships of different faith, and actually really enjoy asking them questions, and asking them questions about their faith, or for people who don't have a faith, even asking why they don't have a faith, just gives rise to, again, those opportunities for spiritual conversations. So hopefully that's been interesting and helpful for you. Just some ways that we can take those conversations into a spiritual realm.
There are opportunities everywhere, and I think it's just being mindful and prayerful as we go into everyday situations, and just keeping our eyes open for how we can sow those seeds of faith into conversations. As we wrap up today, here are 2 standouts just to help us continue to have spiritual conversations. Firstly, remember to ask questions. We know this is a great way to drop conversations down to more spiritual things. Don't be afraid to allow the other person to speak and to share their beliefs, and to ask those questions of them. Research has shown that asking questions is a more influential way of changing behaviour than giving information. Secondly, sow a seed. Look for opportunities to sow seeds. They're simple, they're in everyday contexts, they're many and varied. As your friend journeys closer to Jesus, you'll be able to share more about Jesus, but sowing a seed is often just dropping really simple things in to let people know that we are Christians, or to pique their interest in some way. Sometimes we are so anxious about not having all the answers. Well, this is a video of a guy who did have the answers, and yet he actually missed the question and the real thing that was being asked.
Have you ever made a mistake in sharing your faith? Have you ever had an encounter with somebody with a different belief, and then you walk away and thought, man, I just blew it? I sure have. a number of years ago when I graduated from college. I had just taken an apologetics class with the great J.P. Moore, and I learned how to defend my faith and was looking for opportunities. I was up in Breckenridge, Colorado. I went to get my hair cut. And as I sat down, the lady who was cutting my hair noticed I had a Christian book. And she said, "Oh, is that a Christian book?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Do you mind if I ask you some questions?" I said, "I don't mind at all." She said, "Why does God allow evil?" And honestly, sadly looking back, my first thought was, that's all you got? This is easy. I jumped in, I said, well, you can't even have evil without good, and you can't have good without God. Your very question assumes there's a God. I said, besides, God gives us free will. He didn't want us to be robots. I was giving her all the good apologetic arguments that I knew. And then she asked me a question, bam, I was ready and I shot it down. And then all of a sudden, while she's cutting my hair, she stops and she's crying. And she says, this is a bunch of, I'll leave it blank and let your imagination run wild. And I'm not gonna lie, it actually made me kind of nervous because she was holding scissors to my head. And I remember sitting there thinking, what is the matter with her? My goodness, we're having a great conversation. Why did she get so upset? And she looks at me and she goes, you have an answer for everything. It can't be that simple. Well, I felt bad, changed the subject, gave her a big tip. I was walking out. I said to my friend, I said, man, she was so sensitive. What's the matter with her? He stopped to look at me and he said, McDowell, do you have any reason how arrogant you just were towards her? And it was like a sledgehammer. I stopped and I realized I was so concerned with winning an argument. I was so concerned with making a point. I didn't even take the time to listen and the time to understand. This is one of the biggest mistakes I've learned. And out of it, one thing I do is I try to ask a lot more questions and understand where somebody's coming from rather than make statements. Because to be honest, I spend a lot of time answering questions that people might not really be asking. In particular, on the issue of suffering and evil, whenever somebody says, why does God allow evil? If I can, I'll simply say, gosh, that's a great question. Of all the questions you can ask about God, why that one? You know what I've realized? That although this might be an apologetic or philosophical question at times, oftentimes it comes from a heart that's hurt, somebody who's suffering, and they're wondering how they can be comforted and believe in a God through that pain. How we answer that is very, very different. So get out there, share your faith, be bold and have conversations, but make sure you ask questions. Make sure you understand the question that people are really asking so you can address it in a proper way.
Finally, this week, we encourage you to practice your conversation skills. See if there's someone who you can have a spiritual conversation with. You know, as we've said, it just starts with chit-chat. By listening well, we go to a meaningful conversation place. So listen to their answers, see if you can ask questions then that lead to a spiritual conversation. For example, you might ask someone about their beliefs. Or perhaps you have seen something even in the news and you raise that and you ask what their perceptions or their beliefs are in response to what is going on in our world. If you have time, you can repeat the listening activity that we started with. But this time, use a spiritual question. So for example, you might have one person ask the other, have you ever changed your mind on something spiritual? And then practice listening and practice speaking to each other.